Hello and welcome to week 11 of business law. This week we're going to cover two chapters of the book. I'm going to emphasize the things that I think are the most important and may not jive completely with what the book covers. We're going to talk mainly about breach of contract, what happens when one of the parties doesn't hold up their end of the bargain. And also remedies, which is, what do we do about that? How do we make that situation right, legally speaking? We'll also touch on warranties. We talked about products liability way back in the torts chapter, but we'll talk a little bit about warranties here because it kind of goes along with the idea of a breach and what do we do about it. So we're going to cover those subjects this week. Well, most of the time so far, we've been talking about how do we get to a contract, and what are the requirements of the contract, and so on and so forth. This week, we're going to talk about what happens when we do have a contract, and then one of the parties to the contract fails to perform. In other words, they breach the contract. We're going to talk about, what constitutes a breach, and also what do we do about it. In other words, what are the remedies that are available? And remedy, we use that word sometimes in everyday language to talk about, like a cure to a disease. You have a remedy for that. Well, the law gives us certain remedies that helps make the situation better when one of the parties breaches a contract. And we will look at the available remedies to the innocent party when the other party doesn't hold up their end of the deal. And so that's mainly what we're going to be looking at this week. First of all, we need to point out that there are no criminal penalties for breach of contract. Breaching a contract does not make you a horrible person necessarily. We're kind of used to the idea that, a man's word is his bond and, that sort of thing. And, that's true. And certainly there is that idea in the business world as well. However, with contracts, the law recognizes that sometimes it's a good thing to breach a contract. Sometimes society is actually better off if a contract is breached, because sometimes performing the contract would make all of us worse off than we would be if the contract were breached. How is that possible? Well, let's look at an example here. In our example, Neosho Oil Company has contracted to buy a certain amount of crude oil from Amoco every month at the market price. And of course, they have an idea of what that market price is going to be when they sign the contract. Well, there's a war in the Middle East, and the price of oil quintuples and goes up 5 times. If Neosho Oil fully performs under its contract with Amoco, paying the inflated price for the oil, it will be bankrupt, go out of business, and 100 people will lose their jobs. So in that situation, would it be better for Neosho Oil to keep its word and perform, or breach its contract and save itself from bankruptcy and the jobs of all of its employees? So sometimes we have a situation where it's actually a good thing to breach a contract. So don't get caught up in thinking that someone is a horrible person if they breach a contract. As we said, that's kind of our thinking that, if you break your word, you're a bad person, and maybe you are, but legally speaking, there are no criminal penalties. You won't go to jail for breaching a contract, and sometimes a breach is actually a good thing. We call that an efficient breach. Even so, when a breach does occur, the party who is breaching the contract is required to make things right with the innocent party. They can't just, shake the dust off their feet and walk away, and they actually have to make sure that the innocent party isn't harmed by this. And that's where we'd get into the talk about remedies. So in this unit, we're going to define, first of all, what a breach of contract actually is. Then we're going to talk about the remedies that an innocent party is entitled to when a breach does, in fact, occur. Until a contract has been fully performed or performance is excused, and we talked about how that can be done by something like impossibility, then a party is going to be obligated to perform all the duties set forth in the contract. And normally, we will require what is called complete or strict performance. And this occurs when the obligated party discharges all of his duties in exactly the way called for in the contract. No variation from what the contract specifies in any way, shape, or form, no matter how minor. For example, let's say Seneca Peaches contracts to ship 300 cases of canned peaches by UPS to an address in Brooklyn, New York by May 2nd, 2010. In order to discharge its duty, what must Seneca Peaches do? Well, it has to ship 300 cases of canned peaches by UPS to the address in Brooklyn, New York, no later than May 2nd. It must do everything it agreed to do in exactly the way it agreed to do it. And if that varies in any way, shape, or form, then we're going to have a breach of contract. A contracting party is usually only discharged either by complete performance or by tender of performance. So what is tender of performance? Well, they're offering to fully perform, basically. Let's look at an example here. Again, Seneca Peaches. It does everything it's supposed to do, and the peaches arrive in Brooklyn on time. However, the buyer decides to breach the contract and refuses to accept the peaches. Will Seneca Peaches be obligated under the contract until they hunt down the buyer and force him to accept the shipment? Well, no. So here in this situation, Seneca Peaches is fully performing. They get their peaches together, they ship them to New York, but the truck pulls up to the loading dock, and the buyer is not going to open the door and accept the shipment of peaches. Says, "Go away! I don't want the peaches anymore." Well, the Seneca Peaches have to bust down his door and say, "Here are your peaches," and shove them through the door and drive away really fast before he can do anything about it, and in order to actually perform. Well, the answer is no. Seneca Peaches tendered its performance under the contract. It did everything it was supposed to do to deliver the peaches, and it's not their fault that the buyer breached the contract. So in this situation, although technically Seneca Peaches didn't fully perform because they didn't deliver the peaches because the buyer wouldn't accept delivery, they did everything they possibly could to discharge their duties, and so they're going to be um, off the hook under this contract. And so that's what we mean by complete performance or tender of performance. Either you actually did everything that you could, or you did everything in your power to do what you were supposed to do, and through no fault of your own, the other party backed out. So there we have either performance or tender of performance, and either one of those things is going to let you off the hook under the contract. Well, we already mentioned this earlier, but complete performance occurs when the parties carry out their duties as called for in the contract to the letter. In other words, no variation at all. Well, sometimes we have a situation where one of the parties does something a little bit different than called for in the contract, but it's not really a big deal. When that happens, that's called a minor breach. For example, back to our peaches here, what if Seneca Peaches shipped the right number of peaches to the right address on time, but used FedEx instead of UPS, which was called for in the contract? The contract specified UPS, so that would be a breach of contract, technically. The contract has not been strictly performed. Does that mean the buyer can call the deal off and refuse to pay for the peaches that showed up in white boxes rather than brown boxes? Probably not. Because here, what really is the harm? Because the peaches that were ordered they got there when they were supposed to get there, they just showed up on a different truck. So is that really going to be a big deal? Usually not, but technically that does constitute a breach. It just happens to be a minor breach. When we have a minor breach of the contract, we say that the contract has been substantially performed. That is different than complete performance or strict performance, where every little detail of the contract was performed perfectly. However, we know that if there has been substantial performance, the non-breaching party really hasn't been hurt very much. And there's really not a lot of harm there. If you get your peaches off the FedEx truck instead of the UPS truck, it's really not going to matter very much one way or the other. We would let the non-breaching party, in this case whoever's getting the peaches, recover money damages from the breaching party if the minor breach caused any extra expense. So if it actually cost more to send them FedEx than UPS, they'd be entitled to that difference. If the peaches arriving through a different carrier did not cause the buyer any harm, then the buyer is probably not entitled to any damages at all. So even though the contract was technically breached, it didn't cause any harm, and so we're not going to allow them to sue you for sending the peaches on the wrong truck. So usually a minor breach doesn't cause a whole lot of problem. However, once in a while, a minor breach might allow for the recovery of damages. Let's look at an example where that might happen. Here we have Phil's roof being damaged in a hailstorm. To fix it, he hires Bob's Roofing to put on new shingles. Phil signs a contract with Bob's that calls for the installation of shingles with a 30-year guarantee. Bob's Roofing promptly scrapes off all the old shingles and installs new ones. However, when the job is complete, Phil discovers that Bob's mistakenly installed shingles with a 20-year guarantee, not the 30-year shingles agreed upon in the contract. So the shingles are the same size, shape, and color from the same company and everything like that. They're just a little bit cheaper. than the ones that Bob really wanted and that were specified in the contract. So maybe a little gray area whether this is a minor breach or something more substantial, but we'll say for our purposes that it's a minor breach. But whether it is or not, in this case, the contract has not been completely performed because the wrong shingles were put on, Bob's roofing screwed up. So what do we do about that? We have two different options to make things right in this situation. The first thing we could do is make Bob's roofing climb back up on the roof, scrape off all the perfectly good 20-year shingles they just installed, and replace them with the right shingles. Do we want to do that though? Because that would be very expensive. Bob's Roofing is going to take a big hit on this deal. They'd be wasting all those shingles and have to pay for the new ones, and it'd also be wasteful. We're going to scrape off all these perfectly good shingles that weren't quite what was called for in the contract, but there's really nothing wrong with them. They're going to last another 20 years. So do we really want to do that? Does that make a lot of sense? Well, our other option is we can treat the contract as having been substantially performed. In order to make things right then, Bob's is going to have to compensate Phil for the difference in value of the shingles he wanted versus the shingles that he got. The shingles that were actually installed were cheaper than the ones that Phil wanted because they're not as good. So Phil's going to incur the expense of replacing the shingles again 10 years sooner than he had planned on. So that's certainly worth something. Phil's going to be out some money on that a little sooner than he was intending to. So we can make Bob's Roofing refund some of the money to Phil to compensate him for this minor breach. We're not going to make Bob climb back up there and scrape off the good shingles and put on different shingles, but we will make him cough up some of the money because he did breach the contract. It was just a minor breach. He substantially performed, and so we will let him make this right by giving Phil some money back, but we're not going to force him to redo his roofing job. So that's how we can handle a situation if we consider it a minor breach that's substantially performed. And we'll just say, okay, well, you don't have to perform anymore, but you have to make the situation right by compensating the party who suffered from this breach, even though it happened to be a fairly minor one. Well, I've been looking at minor breaches. More serious than a minor breach is what we call a material breach. With a minor breach, the parties end up more or less where they expected to be. And so, like in the last example, Phil expected to get nice new shingles on his roof, and he did. They just weren't quite the shingles that he asked for. So Phil ended up mostly where he wanted to be, but not quite where he wanted to be. But it wasn't a huge problem. We could fix that. And so, not a terribly big deal. Or, we talk about the peaches arriving on the FedEx truck instead of the UPS truck. Again, you still have your peaches, you still have them on time where you wanted them delivered. They just came, on with a different carrier, so it's really not a big deal. So that's what we're talking about with a minor breach. Sometimes we have something more significant than that, and we call that a material breach. With a material breach, the contract has not at all lived up to the expectations of the parties. So at least one of the parties didn't end up anywhere near where they wanted to be after the contract was going to be performed. So again, going back to our peaches, let's say that our buyer in New York contracts to buy 300 cases of peaches. Instead, Seneca Peaches sends out 300 cases of pears. Pears are disgusting. If you don't believe me on that, go try eating a pear sometime. Understandably, the buyer is upset because he is in no way getting what he bargained for under the contract, and so this is a material breach. Bad breach. We wanted nice wholesome fruit, instead we got a bunch of nasty pears. So this is completely, the buyer's not at all ending up where he wanted to be after this contract is performed. So that is what we would consider a material breach. The parties are completely not where they wanted to be at the end of that deal. Another example here, let's go back to Phil and his roof. Let's say that he contracts with Bob's Roofing to have 30-year shingles installed on his roof, just like we had in the prior example. But then Phil leaves town because he doesn't like the sound of hammers. But when he returns, he sees that Bob's Roofing didn't use shingles at all. Instead, they installed a metal roof. And now Phil's house looks like a machine shed, and all his neighbors are laughing at him and pointing their fingers. And so Phil is very upset. So clearly this is a material breach. Phil got something completely different than what he really wanted to end up with. So you might be asking yourself, well, what is the difference between a minor breach and a material breach? Well, the answer is a minor breach is minor and a material breach is worse than that. And it's kind of hard to come up with a bright line rule that separates the two because it really depends upon the circumstances. You really have to look at that particular case and try to answer that question, and it's not always that easy to do. And in fact, the parties will oftentimes, after there is a breach, they can end up in court arguing about whether a breach is minor or material, and that makes a big difference sometimes. So again, there's no. It's kind of like one of those you'll know it when you see it kinds of things under particular circumstances. What might be considered a minor breach in one circumstance will end up being a material breach in another. It just really depends on the circumstances. Sometimes it's obvious that it's clearly not what the parties had bargained for, but other times it's a little more of a closer case. So it really just depends on the particular circumstances of each case. So let's say that we have a material breach. A material breach occurs. What do we do now? The innocent non-breaching party, the one who's not at fault, has two different options. The first option is they can rescind the contract, which means cancel it and start over. So in our example here, if Phil decides to rescind the contract with Bob's Roofing because of the material breach, and this is the scenario where he had the metal roof installed instead of the shingles, that means that the parties will be put back in the positions they were in before they signed the contract. And so, to do that, Bob's Roofing is going to have to climb back up there on Phil's roof and remove the ugly metal roof that Phil's neighbors are laughing at. Also, Phil is going to get his money back. And so we put the parties back to where they were before they entered into the contract. At the end of the day, Bob's didn't earn any money on the job. Of course, they incurred some expense because they screwed up, but that's their fault. And Phil still needs a new roof. And so Bob's didn't earn anything on this deal, and Phil still has to go find some competent contractor to come put his shingles on. So the parties are pretty much back where they started before they signed this poor, ill-fated contract. So that's one option, just basically rescind the contract, the parties back out, and we try to put them back to where they were before they signed this contract. Well, the innocent non-breaching party has another option as well. They can affirm the contract and sue for money damages. In other words, they have the option to rescind, but they're not going to do that. They're going to stick with the contract, and they will sue for damages to try to put them where they wanted to be financially at the end of the deal. So in Phil's case, let's say he doesn't want to rescind the contract and start all over again. He has that metal roof up there. It's ugly, but the rainy season is approaching, and he really wants to have a roof on his house. So he can decide to affirm the contract, which means just stick with it, despite the material breach. And then, just like the situation where we had a minor breach, he can demand that Bob's Roofing pay him money damages for the bad position he finds himself in due to their breach of contract. In other words, Bob says, or Phil, I'm sorry, says, guys, you put this horrible, nasty, ugly roof up, but rather than have you climb back up there and take it off, I'm going to keep the roof, even though it's a crappy roof and it's not what I asked for, but you're going to pay me the difference in money. So you're going to pay me some damages to make me whole again because I paid you for a really nice roof, and you gave me a crappy roof. And so Bob's is going to have to pay money to Phil. And so he'll get some money damages because of the crappy job that they did, not following directions. And Phil gets to keep his roof. And so a little bit different there. In the first option, Phil would get all of his money back. Well, here he's not going to get all of it because that ugly metal roof is worth something. It's not the roof he wanted, but it is a roof and doesn't leak. And so it's up there protecting his house. And so he will keep that and then get the difference in value between the good roof that he actually ordered and the crappy roof that he actually got. So those are our two major options there. Sometimes we have a situation where a contract is being performed where one of the parties discovers they will be unable to perform the contract as agreed and then informs the other party that they cannot perform the contract. That's what we call an anticipatory breach or anticipatory repudiation. Let's look at an example where that might occur. Here we have Pineville Flooring Company entering into a contract to buy carpet from Georgia Mills, a company that makes floor coverings. The carpet is supposed to be delivered on April 15th. On April 10th, before the delivery is due, the carpet has not yet been made, and Georgia Mills employees all go on strike, shutting down all of its factories. Georgia Mills knows there is no way in the world it's going to be able to make and deliver the carpet to Pineville Flooring on time. So Georgia Mills CEO picks up the phone and calls Pineville Flooring and says, look, I'm really sorry, but we're not going to be able to perform our contract. So there we have an anticipatory breach. The breach hasn't actually occurred yet. The breach isn't going to occur until the carpet hasn't gotten there and the clock strikes midnight on April 16. So we haven't, reached the point of breach yet because there's a time limit there. But Georgia Mills realizes there's no way they're going to make that deadline. And so they just call up and say, hey guys, you don't need to wait around another 5 days. There's just no way we're going to get you your carpet. And so that's an anticipatory breach. Basically, they're breaching in advance. They're saying, we know we're going to breach anyway, so we're just having the courtesy to let you know ahead of time. And so that's an anticipatory breach. When an anticipatory breach occurs, that immediately relieves a non-breaching party from any further obligations under the contract. So let's say that Pineville Flooring hadn't yet paid the full price for the carpet yet, but was supposed to pay half on April 1 and the other half on April 12. Will Pineville Flooring still have to pay the second half of the purchase price, even though it just got a call from Georgia Mills on April 10 saying that the contract would be breached? Well, the answer is no. An anticipatory breach excuses the innocent party from continuing to perform. And so this kind of makes sense because, would it, technically, has there been a breach yet? Well, no. We can't technically have a breach until April 16 when the carpet hasn't been delivered. But are we going to make the parties go through these motions even though they know how the story is going to end badly? And the answer is no. The anticipatory breach on April 10 will relieve Pineville Flooring from continuing to perform because we don't want them to have to send the second half of their payment on April 12 just in order to get a refund later. That doesn't make any sense. And so we'll just let the parties pretend that they breached already, basically. And so that's what an anticipatory breach is. And it relieves the other party from having to continue to perform on a contract they know is not going to work out anyway. Once an anticipatory breach occurs, the innocent party doesn't have to wait any longer to sue the breaching party for damages either. Let's say that Pineville Flooring had ordered the carpet to fulfill a contract of its own to lay down carpet in the headquarters of the Bank of Goodman. Pineville Flooring was expecting to make $1,000 in profit on its deal to lay carpet for the bank. Now that Georgia Mills won't be sending the carpet, there is no way that Pineville Flooring will be able to meet its contractual obligation to the Bank of Goodman, and it's going to lose out on making the $1,000 it could have made if Georgia Mills had performed. So Pineville Flooring can sue Georgia Mills for damages right away. It does not have to wait until April 15 and make sure the carpet is not delivered before it files its lawsuit. The anticipatory breach is just like a real breach. So the parties can stop performing and we can go ahead and sue for money damages to try to make things right. So again, just like an actual material breach, an anticipatory breach, not only excuses performance, but also gives the offended party the right to go ahead and sue for damages without having to wait any longer in order to do that. Now we're going to talk more about remedies. What happens? How do we put a party whole when a breach occurs? And we've already seen some examples of this, but we're going to talk about the different legal remedies that are available. When you're talking about breach of contract, the ordinary remedy, the default rule, is that we will award some kind of money damages. So if a contract is breached, the normal remedy is not to make the parties go ahead and perform. It's not to, do something else. Usually money is changing hands, and that's how we make this right. Because when a contract at its core is a commercial transaction, and so the parties are both hoping to make money on the deal, and so we will make sure that money changes hands in order to keep the innocent party from being harmed. And that's what we do. A court is normally going to order the payment of money damages. So when we have this situation, a court will issue an order ordering the breaching party to pay the non-breaching party some kind of money. Money damages may be paid whether the breach was minor or material. We already saw examples of both in order to make things right. However, there are several different types of money damages available, different categories, and we're going to look at those in some detail now going forward. The most common type of money damages that we have is what we call compensatory damages. And those are designed to compensate the innocent party for any actual losses it suffered due to the breach of contract. And so the goal is to place the innocent party in the same financial position he would have been in if the contract had been performed. the amount of compensatory damages is designed to give the innocent party what we call the benefit of the bargain he made and lost due to the breach. And so, in other words, if, for example, the innocent party was expecting to make $10,000 in profit because of this contract, then we will award him $10,000 of compensatory damages. We're trying to put the parties in the financial position they thought they were going to be in if the contract had been fully performed. And so that's the idea. Let's look at a couple of examples of compensatory damages. Here we have Sue, who is an art dealer. She is working with a buyer, George, who comes to her and says, "If you can get me an original Renoir painting, I will pay you $1 million for it." Sue contacts another art dealer, Dave, who has an original Renoir he is willing to sell for $500,000. Sue contracts with Dave to buy the painting so she can resell it to George and make a $500,000 profit for herself. Later, Dave calls Sue and says, "Sorry, I'm not going to sell you that painting after all. I found somebody else who was willing to give me $600,000 for it, so I sold it to him." So here Dave is a dirty, rotten scoundrel. We can get over our animus toward him and just move forward. But he backs out on the deal, so he's breached the contract with Sue. And so the question is, what is Sue going to be entitled to now that she is the innocent party to a contract that was breached by Dave? Well, Sue was all set to make a $500,000 on her deal with Dave. She was going to pay $500,000 for this painting, and if Dave had kept the bargain, she was going to have that painting to sell to a ready, willing, and able buyer who was going to give her $1 million for it. So she was going to make 100% profit on this. She was going to make $500,000 on this deal. So Sue's $500,000 profit was the benefit of her bargain. She could sue Dave for $500,000, which was the amount she would have made if he had performed, which is called a lost profit. So she can sue for the money she was out there. So that would put her in the same financial position she would have been if Dave had not breached the contract. So this could end up being a very expensive proposition for Dave to breach the contract in this manner for another $100,000. So bad move on his part. Sometimes a breach of contract causes the innocent party's expenses to go up, and so then we have to compensate them for that. Let's look at an example where that would occur. Here we have Newtonia Laboratories and contracts with Jane Scientific Supplies to buy an electron microscope for $400,000. Jane breaches its contract and refuses to deliver the microscope to Newtonia Labs. Newtonia Labs and has to go and find another microscope elsewhere, but the cheapest microscope it can find costs $500,000. So, Newtonia Labs can sue Jane Scientific for $100,000, which is the lost benefit of its bargain. In other words, that's the money it's now out due to the breach of contract. And so it's the same kind of situation here, except we're dealing with negative numbers, really, from the last thing. Instead of a lost profit, here we have an increased cost. And so that was the cost to Newtonia Labs from this breach of contract. They're at $100,000. So it's not a lost profit, but it's an increased cost. It's the same deal. They're still at $100,000, and so that's the compensatory damages that we would award to Newtonia Labs from that Jane Scientific would have to pay because it breached this contract. Continuing with compensatory damages, sometimes we have this come up with employment contracts. And so we have a situation where we have to measure compensatory damages in that scenario. Let's look at an example where that might happen. We have Acme Inc., which offers an employment contract to Sydney to work as its CFO for 5 years at a salary of $1 million a year. Thus, the contract will entitle Sydney to $5 million in salary over the life of the contract. The day before he is supposed to start work, the company calls Sydney and tells him it changed its mind and they don't want him to come to work after all. Sydney ends up finding a different job, but it only pays $700,000 per year. Okay, so what happens in this situation? Well, same kind of deal. Of course, Sydney can sue Acme for breach of contract. He was ready, willing, and able to come fulfill his end of the deal. He was going to go to work for him. He'd already picked out his new tie at Kohl's, and he was ready to go. So he was going to perform, but Acme, the dirty, rotten scoundrels that they are, called him and said, "Sorry, we don't want you after all." So the contract has clearly been breached. They don't want to pay him a salary. So what is going to be Sydney's damages in this situation? Well, the benefit of his bargain would end up being the difference between what he could have made working for Acme, which was $1 million a year, minus what he is actually making at his new replacement job that he found after Acme sent him packing. And that was going to pay him $700,000 a year. So the difference between those two would be the benefit of his bargain, what he would have been, the financial position he would have been in if Acme had actually performed. So Sidney could claim $300,000 per year over 5 years of the original contract, or a total of $1.5 million as the benefit of the bargain he lost because of Acme's breach. And so he ended up getting a job, but the job didn't pay as much as Acme was going to pay him, and so he lost out. The benefit of his bargain with Acme ended up being $300,000 per year, and so that's the amount that he was damaged. Well, at this point, you might be wondering, well, what would have happened if our person in our example here, Sidney, had failed to go out and even look for another job? What if he just sat at home? How would we have measured the damages then? Well, the law requires that even innocent parties have to work hard to minimize the damages they suffer due to a breach of contract. And so they can't just sit around letting the damages pile up. So in our example, Sydney then went out and found another job. This new job paid less than what the Acme job would have, and Acme had to make up the difference. So that's the example that we already looked at. Well, how would it be different if Sydney were a lazy bum? When Acme breached the contract, what if Sydney had not gone out looking for another job? Instead, what if he had gone home and sat around all day eating coconut bonbons, letting his damages accumulate, and then sued Acme for the entire salary they would have had to pay him? How would we measure his damages then? Would we let him get away with that? Well, the law does not look favorably upon people who purposefully let their damages add up without even trying to minimize them. In other words, even an innocent party has a duty to mitigate his damages, and mitigate just means minimize or lessen. So in this situation, Sidney can't just sit around eating coconut bonbons. He has to be actively trying to minimize the damages. In this case, he has to be looking for another job. And so he has to be on the job hunt. And, if he tries, honestly tries to find another job and can't, and then, we're not going to penalize him for that. But if he doesn't even try and he just sits around like, ha ha, your damages are piling up, and doesn't try to do anything about it, we're not going to look favorably on him when he does that. And a court might say, well, you probably could have gone out and gotten another job and would have guessed, well, what his salary might have been if he had actually tried to get another job, and would only award him that rather than the whole amount. And so even if you're an innocent party when it comes to the contract breach, you can kind of get less innocent if you don't try to mitigate your damages. And so the law requires you to do. So we talked about the duty to mitigate in the context of Sydney, not sitting around eating bonbons. Also, let's look at another example too. Kind of looking at the flip side here, where we have the Jane Scientific and Newtonia Labs example for the sale of that electron microscope. Well, and remember the earlier example, after Jane Scientific had breached its contract and backed out, Newtonia Labs went and looked and found the cheapest electron microscope that it possibly could, and it would still cost more than the one they were going to buy from Jane Scientific, and so the difference in value was a measure of damages. Well, what if Newtonia Labs, rather than looking for the cheapest electron microscope that it could find, went out and found the most expensive electron microscope on the market? And so they were going to buy, the AMC Gremlin of electron microscopes to begin with. But since Jane Scientific breached the contract, they say, aha, we're going to go get the Lamborghini of electron microscopes now, and we'll stick Jane Scientific with the difference in price. Can they do that? Well, if they try to do that, Jane Scientific could raise a defense of failure to mitigate damages once Newtonia Labs sued them. And so Newtonia Labs would have a duty to go try to find the cheapest comparable microscope it could, thus mitigating the damages. Now, it's important to say comparable here because there might be, another microscope on the market that was even cheaper that didn't do all the things the one that Jane Scientific was going to sell them did. I don't know what electron microscopes do, but I'm sure that they come with bells and whistles sometimes. And so, if the electron microscope they were going to buy, was gold plated or something from Jane Scientific, and the one that they ended up with was silver plated instead and much cheaper, that wouldn't be comparable. So anyway, the cheapest comparable microscope is the one that the Newtonia Labs has the duty to go try and find and mitigate their damages. So they have to go looking for an electron microscope that's like the one they were going to buy, but as cheap as they can. They can't go purposefully looking for the most expensive thing around just in order to stick Jane Scientific with the damages, and so that would be unfair, and we don't let them get away with that. We're still looking at money damages now, but we're going to look at a type of money damages called consequential damages. And certainly compensatory damages are the most common form of money damages awarded in a breach of contract case. But sometimes we're also able to get the second category of money damages called consequential or special damages. And these are designed to make up for losses that the innocent party suffers because of circumstances that are external to the contract itself, but which are foreseeable to the breaching party. And so when the guilty party breaches the contract, of course, we're worried about the benefit of the bargain. That's what compensatory damages compensate the innocent party for. But the innocent party may also suffer other damages too. And so let's look at an example to see how that might happen. In our example, we have a restaurant, Turkey Filet, which closed down for a week to do some renovation work. Part of the renovation involved installing a new computerized cash register system. To install the system, Turkey Filet, which we're going to call TFA after this because it's a lot shorter, hired Flowerbox Computer Systems for $10,000. The contract was signed in September, and Flowerbox was supposed to install the system on December 5. On December 4, Flowerbox notified TFA that it was breaching the contract and would not install the cash register system. TFA scrambled to find a new company to install the system. Finally, it hired American Cash Register to do the job for $15,000. However, American Cash Register was already booked up and wasn't able to install the system until December the 20th. In all, TFA was closed for 15 days longer than it had planned. TFA estimated it would have been earning $10,000 in profit every day it would have been open if Flowerbox had done the job on time. Since it was closed 15 extra days, TFA had $150,000 in lost profits due to Flowerbox's breach of the contract. So, in this situation, Flowerbox agreed to do the job for $10,000 and it breached. So TFA has to go spend $15,000 to get someone else to do the job. So we already know from our study of compensatory damages that TFA should get awarded $5,000, which is the difference. It's the extra expense that is out because the contract is breached. That's its benefit of the bargain. It was going to get this done for $10,000. Now it has to spend $15,000. And so $5,000 is what's going to make Flowerbox, or going to make TFA whole in this situation to get them back to where they would have been if the contract hadn't been breached. But we know that's not all the damage they suffered, because as a consequence of the breach, TFA had to remain closed an extra 15 days. During that time, it could have been open and earning a profit if Flowerbox had not breached the contract. And so that's Flowerbox's fault. Also, it would have been foreseeable to Flowerbox that pulling out of the contract at the last minute like that is going to put TFA in a real tight spot and would have slowed down the renovation work. I mean, they backed out the day before the contract was due, so they knew this was going to cause some real problems for the restaurant. So, Flowerbox may be liable not only for the $5,000 in compensatory damages, but for the additional $150,000 in consequential damages. So this could end up being a real bad situation for Flowerbox for pulling out at the last minute. And you can see why this makes sense from a justice and fair play kind of standpoint. Certainly, the restaurant lost its benefit of the bargain there when it had to go pay an extra $5,000 to get the cash register done. But if you back out of a contract and breach it at the last moment like that, it's reasonable to expect that bad things are going to flow from that. And so is it fair to stick them with this extra consequential damages? Arguably it is. It might not be the full amount, depends on how the court would rule with that. But you can see sometimes breaching a contract does more than take away the benefit of the bargain. Sometimes it causes many other problems as well. So there are other consequences that flow from the breach, and you may be liable for those consequences as well. So, maybe Flowerbox was thinking, oh, well, we'll breach the contract and it won't cost that much. Well, they might be in for a rude awakening on this. So, something to remember before you go breach a contract. Still talking about money damages, we also have something called liquidated damages, which are another type of money damages. Sometimes in the contract itself, the parties will specify what the amount of damages are going to be if there is a breach, if either party ends up breaching the contract. So it's almost like a prenuptial agreement for a marriage. You're kind of planning for the contract to fail, and this is what will happen if it fails. They will go ahead and specify the amount of damages that will be due to the innocent party if one of the parties breached the contract. The law does allow this, where we have two things that are true. The first thing is the amount of damages would be hard to determine otherwise. So if it would be hard to calculate the damages in any of our normal methods, we'll allow this. And also, if the amount of damages bear some proportion to the loss and aren't designed to be a penalty for the breach. And so what we don't want to have happen is the parties to write in some kind of gotcha clause into the contract. So if somebody breaches, I gotcha, want to stick you with some big penalty, basically. We don't want to let parties do that. And it just doesn't serve any purpose in society, really, if we let that go on. And so these two situations are true. It's hard to measure the damages to figure out what the actual compensatory damages would be. And we're not talking about some kind of gotcha sort of penalty, and then we may allow this to happen. So let's look at an example of this. In our example, Wilma signs a contract to buy Fred's house. The contract says that Wilma has to pay $1,000 immediately. That will be counted toward the sale price of the house, and that the sale of the house will close in 30 days. So fairly standard real estate contract. Furthermore, if Wilma backs out, breaches a contract, and refuses to buy the house, Fred will keep her $1,000 as liquidated damages. So the reason we have the damages in there, if Wilma backs out of the contract, Fred will have lost something. First of all, he will have to go to the hassle of trying to find another buyer for his house. So if she backs out, he's going to have to get the real estate sign back out of the garage and stick it back in the yard and, get the realtor working again. It'll take longer than he expected to sell the house, so he'll have to continue paying utilities and stuff. And the time that, between when Wilma said, I'll buy the house, and she backs out, maybe there had been other potential buyers during that time that would have bought the house if it's still been on the market. We don't know. So clearly, Fred has suffered some sort of damage in this situation. But it would be really hard to measure the damages Fred actually suffered. How much is your inconvenience worth? We've looked at examples before with compensatory damages to where, like the turkey fillet cash register, well, we know they were going to spend $10,000, they had to go spend $15,000 instead, ta-da, $5,000. Okay, well, we don't have a situation like that here where we can just, do a little arithmetic and figure out, okay, this is Fred's damages. Well, we know he's lost something. We know he suffered some inconvenience. He may have lost out on potential other buyers. He may, actually have some out-of-pocket expenses, getting the house back on the market and trying to sell it. He may be stuck with it longer. He may have to pay you more utilities. But my goodness, it would take, an army of accountants to figure out exactly how much dollars Fred would actually lose on this deal. And we still wouldn't be sure. They would just be guessing. And so it's really hard to measure the actual damages that Fred would be suffered in this situation. Also, in our example, this amount of money doesn't seem too terribly high, so much it would be unreasonable. It's not designed to penalize Wilma, to send her to the poorhouse or anything. It's just designed to compensate Fred, so it just seems like a fairly reasonable amount. So probably a court would uphold this provision of the contract if Wilma does decide to breach, because again, it's hard to measure actual damages and it's not apparently a penalty. Well, the story would be different if the amount of damages would have been so high as to constitute a penalty. So let's change the facts and say, what if Wilma would have lost $20,000 by failing to buy the house? Then that's definitely more than Fred would need just to compensate him for the lost sale. We don't know exactly what that amount would be that Fred actually loses, but we know it's less than that. That amount is just going to serve to penalize Wilma, and probably a court's not going to uphold it unless there were unique circumstances that made it reasonable. And again, we saw from the turkey fillet example, sometimes there might be consequential damages that would make, something like this really reasonable. That's hard to say, but with the facts that we have, it isn't anything evident that would suggest that Fred would need $20,000 to make him whole. So this is probably a lot more than he would really need to compensate him. So a court would probably not allow this full amount to be awarded to Fred in this situation. But we will point out, as in the law, there's a lot of gray areas, and here there's no bright line that separates reasonable liquidated damages from an unlawful penalty. It all depends on the circumstances. It depends on the subject matter that we're dealing with. Is it a house? Is it a business? Is it something else? The time crunch and all kinds of other stuff would come into play here. So a court would look at each case individually to try to figure out if the liquidated amount is fair or not. So again, no bright line rule, but you can kind of assume if it sounds ridiculously high, a court is probably not going to allow that. One more type of money damages that we have is nominal damages. You may remember we saw this way back in the torts chapter briefly. This is a way for the law to say that the plaintiff is right, but he didn't suffer any real damages, so we're just going to give him some token amount to show that, yes, he was wronged, but he really didn't suffer anything or deserve any great amount of money. Let's look at an example here. Marge contracts to buy a computer from Sarcoxy Microsystems. The contract specifically states that the computer will arrive no later than May 10 and will be shipped by UPS. Sarcoxy Microsystems instead ships the computer by FedEx, in breach of the contract. The computer arrives safely at Marge's house on May 7, 3 days ahead of schedule. Turns out it costs $5 less to ship the computer by FedEx than it would have by UPS. So Marge actually saved money on the shipping charges. Nonetheless, Marge sues the Sarcoxy Microsystems for breach of contract despite the fact that she suffered no actual damages whatsoever. Marge will win the suit because Sarcoxy Microsystems did not strictly perform the contract. However, she will be awarded only nominal damages, probably something like $1. So, yes, they were in breach, but did she suffer? No, actually she came out ahead, but for whatever reason, she's cantankerous and sue-happy, and so she wants to sue them for this, but there's really no compensatory damages we can give her, no consequential damages, none of that stuff. So, yeah, she wins, but, here's your dollar. There's really, she's not going to get very much ahead on that. These suits, where we end up with nominal damages, sometimes are just based on principle, not actual damages. So someone's out to prove a point or something. If all you can get is nominal damages, most reasonable people aren't going to be like Marge. They wouldn't waste their time and money in court. Usually to file a lawsuit, it costs at least $100. So that's not going to get you very far ahead, but it does exist sometimes just to show, yes, the party was wronged, but do they really deserve to recover huge amounts of money? No. And so that's what we will do, is award nominal damages. One additional category of money damages we need to talk about is attorney's fees. And the general rule in American courts is that when you have a lawsuit, plaintiff sues defendant, both parties to that lawsuit are responsible for their own legal costs. In other words, it doesn't matter if they win or lose, or who wins or who loses. Both the plaintiff has to pay his attorney, the defendant has to pay his attorney. That's the typical rule. It doesn't matter who wins the lawsuit, both parties are responsible for paying their own attorney's fees. The plaintiff cannot normally get the court to award him attorney's fees, even if he wins the lawsuit. So if he could, that would force the defendant to pay two attorney's bills, his own and the plaintiff's. But that's usually not the case in the civil suits that we see in this country. This is called the American rule because that's the practice in American courts. It's not the case the world over, though. In Britain and other British countries, or countries that used to be part of the British Empire, to be more precise, they follow what's called the English rule, where the losing party has to pay the legal costs for both plaintiff and the defendant. As you might imagine, this cuts down on litigation quite a bit, because a plaintiff, when he files a lawsuit, he's taking a huge financial risk by bringing that suit, because if he loses his case, not only is he going to have to pay his own lawyer, he's going to have to pay the defendant's legal bills too. And legal bills aren't cheap a lot of the time. On the good side, though, if the plaintiff wins, the defendant has to pay his legal bills and the plaintiff's legal bills both. So that's the general rule in Great Britain. It is not the general rule in the United States. However, no matter who wins and who loses, both parties are responsible for their own attorney's fees most of the time. Well, American rule prevails in most states in contract cases, just about everywhere, but it's not universal, which is why we're talking about it here. For instance, I went to law school in Arkansas, and last I knew anyway, Arkansas allowed the winning party in a breach of contract suit to recover attorney's fees. So it is possible. It's weird, though. It can happen in some places. So certainly, before you go around suing somebody, that's worth checking into before you file suit. Because that would be a financial risk. If you're going to be forced to pay the other party's attorney's fees if you lose the case, that would be a bad deal. So something to keep in mind. That's it for money damages. Now we're going to move on to other possible remedies, including rescission and restitution. And remember that suing for breach of contract is only one option that's open to an innocent party when a breach of contract occurs. Rather than suing for damages, instead you could ask for a rescission of the contract. And a rescission is simply an undoing of the contract and putting both parties back to the position they were in before they signed the contract. As part of that process, one or both of the parties may end up making restitution, which means returning any money or goods they received under the contract. And so again, they'll have to return anything they received under the contract because we're putting both parties back to where they started before they entered into the contract in the first place. So let's look at an example where this occurs. Here we have Adolfo and Jim entering into a contract for the sale of one gas-powered weed eater. They live 500 miles apart, so Adolfo mails a check to Jim, and Jim ships the weed eater to Adolfo. When the weed eater arrives, Adolfo discovers that the weed eater is not gas-powered, it is electric. This is a material breach of the contract. Adolfo can either keep the electric weed eater and sue for the difference in value between an electric weed eater and a gas weed eater. And if you've ever tried to use an electric weed eater, you know they're not worth much. Or he can rescind the contract. Adolfo elects to rescind the contract. This means that both parties must make restitution. So Adolfo sends the weed eater back to Jim. Jim returns the money to Adolfo. Both parties are now in the same position they were in prior to entering into the contract. So Adolfo, doesn't have a weed eater, but he also isn't out that money. Jim still has his old weed eater he wants to sell, but he has to return the money. So both parties are in the exact same position they were prior to when they entered the deal. So that is a rescission. So when a material breach occurs, the innocent party has the option of either sticking with affirming the contract and suing for damages, or rescinding the contract and seeking restitution. It's the innocent party's choice on what he wants to do. So he can pick, do we stick with the contract and maybe get damages, or do we undo the contract and try to put everybody back to where they were before we started? Now we're going to talk about what we call equitable remedies. And you may remember long ago we discussed there's a difference between law and equity when we were talking about how the court system was set up. And under the original English court system, all that a court could do was award money damages. That was all it could do. It could not issue an injunction. It couldn't force somebody to do something or force somebody not to do something. And so those chancery courts or courts of equity cropped up in order to take care of that kind of thing. So that was kind of to fix a hole in the British legal system. Well, today our courts have the power to both award money damages and to give what we call equitable relief, which is like issuing those injunctions and things, forcing people to do or to not do certain things. Sometimes these equitable remedies come up in contract cases. Ordinarily, we'll only be talking about money damages, but once in a while, the case is kind of special for whatever reason, and so we'll be dealing with one of these equitable remedies. If the subject matter of the contract is unique or special in some way, awarding money damages just isn't going to be good enough to remedy the breach of contract. It's not going to be take care of the benefit of the bargain that we're trying to put give the person who signed the contract. So if the subject matter is unique or something like that, we might be able to do something more than just award money damages. One place where this comes up fairly frequently is when we're dealing with real estate. Land is unique. There are no two pieces of land on planet Earth that are exactly alike. There just aren't. If you drive across Kansas, you might think that most of it is just alike. But in actuality, there's different rolling hills, and the streams are in different places, and the rocks are in different places, and whatever. But anyways, the way the law sees it, there are no two pieces of the Earth's surface that are exactly the same. And so if you're dealing in real estate, that might entitle you to an equitable remedy. Let's look at an example here. Rose lives at 501 South Trotter Lane. Rose has lived there for 40 years and has always wanted to own the vacant lot next door at 503 South Trotter Lane, so she could build an attached garage onto her house and not have to park in the street. Finally, she gets the lot's owner, Gonzo, to agree to sell her the land. Rose and Gonzo enter into a contract for the sale of the land, with the sale to close on April 20. On April 15, Gonzo notifies Rose that he has changed his mind and doesn't want to sell the land, so he's breaching his contract. Well, remember, when we have an innocent breach of contract, the innocent party is suffering here, and our goal is to give them the benefit of their bargain. We want to put them in as good a position as they would have been in if the contract had not been breached. Well, how are we going to do that? Here, no amount of money in the world is going to put Rose in the same position she would have been in if the contract had been performed. Why? Because land is unique. So doesn't matter how much money we award Rose in compensatory damages, she's not going to have the benefit that she was bargaining for, which is owning that next door lot. So no matter how much money we give her, as long as she lives in that house, she's going to have to be parking in the street because she can't build her attached garage. The only thing that would make her whole then is not money damages, but it's to own that lot. So we might be able to help her out here. Instead of just awarding money damages, Rose could ask for an equitable remedy that we call specific performance. This remedy is only available when the subject matter of the contract is unique. And we already saw that land is unique. No two pieces on Earth's surface are exactly the same. Other things that might be unique would be like a painting. If you're trying to buy, Van Gogh's sunflowers or something. I'm not an art person, but some particular painting by some particular artist, and there's no other painting by any other artist in the world that's going to be exactly the same. So no matter how much money we gave you, it wouldn't be the same as owning that painting. So if we're talking about something that is truly unique, then we could have maybe an equitable remedy come into the picture here. Well, what is specific performance? Well, that means that the court issues an injunction, which is just an order, that forces the breaching party to fully perform the contract. And so rather than just award money damages, the judge would issue an injunction saying, Gonzo, go sign over the deed to this land to Rose. And if he didn't do that, he would be in contempt of court and we could lock him up. So the court has ways of forcing people to do things, and that's what would happen here if we have specific performance. So in this case, if Rose asked for a specific performance, the court, if they granted that, they would force Gonzo to go through with the contract. She's still going to owe him the money. She'll have to pay him the money that they agreed to in the contract. So she'll have to perform just like she would have otherwise. But the court would then order Gonzo to sign a deed transferring the land to Rose. And so in other words, rather than undo the contract and put the parties back where they were, and we will force them to go through with the contract, maybe against their will in this case. At least one of the parties doesn't want to do this anymore. But a contract is a contract, and so we would force him to do that because the land that we're talking about is in fact unique. Usually the remedies for breach of contract relate entirely to the economics of the transaction. And so when we're talking about damages and remedies, we're not going to be dealing with things that we would with torts. So we're not going to be dealing with pain and suffering, emotional distress, or even punitive damages. Oh, you breached the contract and, I had to go to therapy for 6 weeks and, I'm physically ill. And, we don't do that. So that's kind of nice in a way that we're not dealing with those kinds of fuzzy issues like how do you award money for pain and suffering. We don't worry about that with contracts. You get hit by a truck, we'll worry about pain and suffering. Somebody breaches their contract, you're going to get the benefit of your bargain. We're not going to worry about the emotional distress it may have caused you or that kind of thing. But Once in a while, we'll have a situation where a contract dispute ends up involving a tort somehow. And there are some kinds of torts that are intimately related with the breach of contract. Let's look at an example here. A person signed a contract to have their driveway asphalted. They paid the money to the quote-unquote contractor, who is really a scam artist. The person took the money, never had any intention of working on the driveway. He just took it and disappeared. So clearly this is a breach of contract because there was a money exchanging hands, mutual assent, consideration, all that stuff, and no performance. So material breach of contract. But it's also a tort, which happens to be fraud, because this person had no intention of performing under the contract at all. So in this case, where there is an intentional tort occurring, punitive damages would also be available. So if the poor sap who signed this contract wanting his driveway asphalted ever caught the guy, he could sue him not only for breach of contract to get his damages, but he could also get punitive damages because of the tort. So there we might have a whole new classification of damages that would be available. Another situation where torts and contracts might get mixed up together is what we call intentional interference with contractual relations, or maybe tortious interference with a contract. Now, this is where a third person induces one of the parties to a contract to breach the contract. Let's look at an example here. Morris Insurance is a small independent insurance agency and has a contract with Zippy Copy to service their copy machine. This service contract costs $1,000 a year. One day, Bruce, an employee with Shady Office Machines, stops by Morris Insurance. Bruce tells Morris that if they breach their contract with Zippy and sign a contract with Shady, that Shady will service their copy machine for only $500 a year. Morris informs Zippy that they are breaching the contract and then signs a new contract with Shady. So here we have multiple bad guys. Morris Insurance Agency here is certainly breaching their contract, which they ought not to do, of course, but they were induced to do that, and they would not have breached their contract but for the fact that Mr. Shady shows up and waves $500 in their face, basically, and induces them to breach this contract. So, again, multiple bad things going on. We have tortious interference with a contract when, first, we have a valid and enforceable contract between two parties. Second, a third person knows of this contract. So there's actual knowledge here. This is intentional. And third, the third person then induces one of the parties to breach the contract. When that happens, then you have all three of these elements. Then you have the tort of intentional interference with contractual relations. So in this example, Zippy could sue Morris for breaching the contract, but Zippy could also sue Shady Office Machines for intentional interference with its contract, so that it'd have a contract claim against Morris that also have a tort claim against Shady. So anyway, sometimes these torts and contracts can get kind of mixed together, and then we'll have a weird situation, maybe punitive damages or something else. So once in a while, it's not just a cut and dried contract case. We might have tort law lurking around in there as well. There's another tort that comes up once in a while, usually in the situation of insurance. And when you buy an insurance policy, that's a contract. The contract says if you promise to pay your premium, the insurance policy promises to pay up if something bad happens. So that's just it's a special kind of contract, but an insurance policy is just a plain old contract. Well, there is a tort that turns up once in a while in insurance cases called the tort of bad faith. The idea is that when you sign a contract, that parties to that contract owe each other a duty to deal fairly, or what we say in good faith. This is called the covenant of good faith and fair dealing. So in other words, you're promised to be a good person, and you're supposed to act fairly when you're dealing with this contract. So if this duty is breached, you have committed a tort, which is a tort of bad faith. So let's look at an example of when this would come up. Susie buys car insurance from All City Insurance. She has a limit of liability of $20,000. Susie pulls out in front of a bus carrying retired folks to the casino and causes an accident. Susie reports the accident to Allcity, and they have a duty to provide a defense attorney and to try to settle the case for less than Susie's policy limit. So when you buy that liability insurance, if you get into an accident that's your fault, what the insurance provides is they'll provide you a defense, so they'll hire a defense attorney for you, and then they have to try to settle your case for less than your insurance policy limits if they can. So Allcity does this, and then they get a settlement offer of $20,000. So the injured old people in the bus are willing to settle their case for the insurance policy limits, which was $20,000. However, the cocky defense attorney that the insurance company hired insists on rejecting the offer and convinces Susie to take the case to trial. Thinks he can win it. Well, at trial, the jury finds Susie liable and awards the old folks $700,000. Well, Susie is forced to pay $680,000 that's not covered by her insurance policy, which just had a limit of $20,000, out of her own pocket. So she's going to be on the hook. Probably have to declare bankruptcy, and that'll follow her for a while if she's a normal person and doesn't have deep pockets. Well, Susie can sue Allcity in this case for not settling the case for less than the policy limit. And because they acted in bad faith. They could have settled her case for the policy limit. They weren't looking out for her best interest, and so they, happily tootled on to court and took the case to trial and lost it and left her in a really bad situation. And so in a case like this, she would have a claim against her own insurance company. Again, you won't see this happen every day in your business career probably, but it can happen, so something to remember. Now we're going to look at remedies in the context of breaching sales and lease contracts. So again, we're going back with our old friend Article 2 of the UCC, and the basic principles of breach of contract and remedies for breach carry over into sales of goods contracts that are covered by Article 2. However, there are some unique features of the UCC, and we're going to take some time to look at those in this section. I'm not going to go into nauseating detail of the UCC here. It does get fairly intricate at times. I would much rather you understood the basics of what constitutes a breach and the remedies for a breach rather than got caught up in all the details of the UCC statutes. But nonetheless, there are some important differences that we're going to look at here. So under Article 2, let's see what happens when the seller is in breach. Well, the seller of goods owes the buyer a duty of perfect tender. That means that they must tender delivery of goods that perfectly conform to the specifications of the contract in every way. In other words, they have a duty to perform the contract to the letter, and the goods are supposed to be exactly as described in the contract itself. If they do not conform to the contract in some way, there is not a perfect tender. And if that happens, then the buyer has three options in terms of remedies under the UCC. First, he can reject the entire shipment of goods and send them back. So basically, he can rescind the contract. Same type of deal. He's just kind of getting out of it, so he'll get his money back. He sends the shipment of widgets back, and we're back where we started. Second, he can accept the entire shipment despite the defects, or the buyer can accept part of the shipment and reject part. For instance, if the contract called for medium socks and half of the shipment was large socks, and the buyer can keep the medium socks and sends the large socks back. So again, we have three options here that we can kind of look at in a little more detail here as we go. Well, if the buyer accepts the non-conforming goods, he can still sue the seller for the difference in value. So remember, that was option 2. He can accept the entire shipment despite the defects. Well, if he does that and the goods are non-conforming, it wasn't a perfect tender, he can sue the seller for the difference in value. Let's look at an example here. A buyer orders Nike shoes, name brand, but the seller ships Xinhua brand shoes from some company in China. Probably made in the same factory, honestly, but anyway, I digress. While the Nike shoes sell for $100 a pair, the off-brand shoes only sell for $25 a pair. If the buyer decides to accept the non-conforming shoes, he can still sue the seller for the difference in value between the Nike shoes he ordered and the crappy shoes that were delivered. So if he decides to not send them back, then he can keep the crappy shoes, but he can also get at least a partial refund, 75% of his purchase price back. So that's option 2. Under the UCC, the parties can alter the perfect tender rule by agreement. And remember, by default, goods have to be perfectly conforming to the contract in every single way. If they differ at all from what's described in the contract, they can be rejected and sent back, and we have those three options open to us. Well, the parties might want to change that. Why would they want to do that? Well, let's look at an example and see. Let's say that we have a really large buyer, such as Walmart, buying socks from a factory in China. Walmart wants to buy 1 billion socks a year. Obviously, when you're talking about 1 billion socks, you're going to find 1 or 2 socks that have some kind of defect. Well, the sock factory does not want to be in the position of having Walmart reject all 1 billion socks just because one has a hole in it. And under the perfect tender rule, they could. If they were supposed to be, intact socks, and one of them's defective, that's not perfect tender. So instead, the parties might agree that the socks will be no more than 2% defective in order to be acceptable to Walmart. So Walmart's going into this contract with the understanding that, they're going to have to, turn 2% of these socks into rags maybe, and because they won't work, they're too small or they're too big or they're the wrong color or they have holes in them or something. But 98% of the socks will conform. As long as we have 98% good socks, then we don't have a problem. We haven't had a breach. And the parties can agree to something like that if they want to. And then in a situation like this, it would benefit both of them. Walmart doesn't want to have to deal with rejecting socks, and it can put up with a 98% success rate, and the factory doesn't want to get a whole shipload of socks back because one pair was wrong. So they can change this by agreement if they want to. Under the UCC, if you do have a shipment of goods that's being rejected because they don't conform, the seller has the opportunity to cure the breach. And they can do that by replacing the non-conforming goods with conforming goods. And so just because there's an initial breach doesn't mean it has to stay breached. We can cure that breach. Let's look at an example of how this could work. Let's say the seller is supposed to deliver 500 cases of medium socks to the buyer by March the 10th. A shipment of socks are delivered on March 7th. However, the buyer notifies the seller that he is rejecting the shipment because they are large socks, not mediums. At that point, the seller still has 3 days left to perform the contract. If the seller can replace a non-conforming socks with conforming socks by March 10, then he will have cured the breach. Then the buyer will have no cause of action to sue him for breach of contract. Although the contract was initially breached, the breach was cured when conforming goods were delivered on time. So once a breach, maybe not always a breach. If we have the chance, if there's still time and we can get conforming goods there, then we can cure that breach and go on. Sometimes a contract for the sale of goods will provide that the goods are to be sent in separate shipments, or what we call under the UCC installments. So let's look at an example when we would have that happening. Let's say that we have a contract for the sale of 100,000 socks, but the socks are to be sent in 10 shipments of 10,000 socks per month. Now let's say that the buyer gets the first shipment of 10,000 socks and they are non-conforming. They might be the wrong size or color, whatever. In this situation, the UCC says that the buyer can reject the shipment of 10,000 socks as non-conforming. However, he usually can't declare a breach of the entire contract for 100,000 socks if just one shipment is bad. Just because that one shipment doesn't conform doesn't mean the entire contract has been breached. When we have situations where that one messed up shipment is going to substantially impair the value of the entire contract, then we'll let the buyer out of the entire contract if he wants to. But just because one shipment out of 10 was messed up, you can reject those goods in that one shipment, but we won't let you out of the entire contract unless, again, the value of the deal is just completely messed over by that. Then we have a different case. But that's the ordinary rule. We've been talking about the buyer's right to accept or reject goods or say that they're conforming or non-conforming. Well, how do we know that unless we have the right to inspect the goods? And the UCC does give the buyer that right. They have the right to inspect the goods in a reasonable manner before accepting the delivery. So just because they show up on your loading dock doesn't mean you've accepted them. You have a chance to open the cases and check them out and make sure that they actually conform before you'll be held to have accepted them. And so that's fairly important because you need to go look at those goods to make sure that they do conform. If the buyer either 1, tells the seller he is accepting the goods, or 2, fails to reject the goods within a reasonable time, he will have accepted the goods and must pay for them. So If the crate of widgets ends up on your loading dock, you go out there and look them over and tell the seller, yeah, those are great widgets, thank you very much. Well, you've accepted them. Or if you just let that crate sit there for 6 months and don't even bother to look in it, then you've accepted them too. You have to go inspect them within a reasonable time, or you will have been deemed to accept them unless you reject them within a fairly reasonable time, usually. Even after the goods are accepted, it may not be possible for the buyer to discover the goods are defective right away. It might only turn up later. And if that happens, then he has a chance to revoke his acceptance and reject the goods. And so there can be an initial acceptance, but if something turns up that he didn't have a chance to discover right away, then he can turn around and reject them after all. And this only occurs under special circumstances, such as if the defect was hidden in some way or hard to discover. For example, again, I don't know why I was so high on socks when I was writing this, but let's say we have a shipment of socks delivered that appear to be conforming. So the shipment is accepted. So the buyer goes, opens the crate, looks at the socks, and they look like beautiful socks. Right size, right color, right material, everything. They look great. So he accepts them. Well, later, the buyer finds out that the socks fall apart the first time they are washed. Well, that's not something the buyer could have discovered just by opening boxes and looking at them there on the loading dock. So the buyer might still be able to reject the shipment of socks after that is discovered. So that might be, weeks later, the buyer gets reports that the socks are, falling apart once they go through the washing machine the first time or something. So we can't discover a defect like that just by looking at it, so that might be one of those special circumstances where we can reject the goods after we accepted them because of this defect that was hard to discover. Once in a while, the buyer may be able to get specific performance in a contract for the sale of goods. And again, specific performance is not our normal remedy. Our normal remedy is going to be money damages. So this is usually going to happen when the goods involved are very unique. And so again, we're talking about, an antique, a Tiffany lamp or some work of art, something like that, something unique. In other words, that can't be easily replaced by getting replacement goods. So let's look at an example here. Helen collects antiques. She enters into a contract to buy the only authentic set of George Washington's wooden teeth in existence from Chris. Chris breaches the contract and refuses to sell the teeth to Helen. Helen cannot obtain replacement goods on the market, so the remedy of money damages would be inadequate. And no matter how much money we give Helen, she cannot go find any more sets of George Washington's wooden teeth. So Helen can sue for specific performance, asking the court to force Chris to sell the teeth to her. And so again, not a normal situation, but when we're dealing with some really unique good that you can't replace easily by buying it somewhere else or a replacement good, then we may allow specific performance. When we have a seller breaching the contract and failing to deliver the goods to the buyer has the right to cover. What cover means is that the buyer can obtain replacement goods, and so long as the buyer is acting in good faith and isn't just trying to stick it to the seller, he can recover the cost of covering from the breaching seller. Let's look at an example here. Judy is installing a new driveway at her house. She contracts with Stark City Concrete to pour her driveway for $1,000. Stark City Concrete breaches the contract and refuses to deliver the cement. So Judy looks high and low, and the next best price she can find is from Fairview Concrete. However, Fairview's price is $1,500. Judy can order the concrete from Fairview in order to cover for Stark City Concrete's breach of contract. Then she can turn around and sue Stark City Concrete for the difference in price, which of course in this example would be $500. And so as the victim of the contract breach here, you can go out and find some kind of replacement goods, and if that ends up costing you, then you might be able to recover that from the person who breached the contract and put you in that position in the first place. Now, this example that we looked at kind of illustrates how damages are normally calculated when we have a seller breaching and failing to deliver on the contract. So you take the market price of the goods at the time of the breach, which is the cost it would take to cover. Here, that was the $1,500 from the second concrete company. That's what we're talking about there. Well, then you subtract the contract price for the goods under the original contract that was breached, and that was $1,000. And so you take $1,000 from $1,500, you end up with $500 in damages. And so that's your basis for calculating damages in this case. You would also add in any incidental damages, which are other costs that were incurred in covering. Well, what's an incidental damage? Well, let's say that Stark City Concrete breached the day before the concrete was needed, and Judy had to pay extra money to get Fairview to show up on short notice. Well, that extra fee could also be added into the total damages, so that would increase the cost of covering, and then she could stick that with the good-for-nothing people that breached her contract in the first place. So we would add on to her original damages the cost of those incidental things that came up. Sometimes, if the buyer can show that it would be either hard or even impossible to cover, in other words, to find any substitute goods, she can sue for replevin of the goods, which means they'll just ask the court to force the seller to deliver the goods that they were promised to deliver in the first place. This is different than specific performance, really, and that's because the goods don't have to be unique. With specific performance, we're dealing with, the only extant copy of the Mona Lisa, or George Washington's wooden teeth that's the only pair in existence, or whatever. Well, here we're not talking about something that's truly unique. It's just something that's scarce enough that the buyer can't easily cover. Let's look at an example here. In October, Ken's Toys signs a contract calling for Bob's Wholesale Products to deliver 10,000 Sneezy Snarfy dolls in time for the Christmas season at a cost of $10 per unit. After the contract is signed, but before the goods are delivered, Sneezy Snarfies suddenly become the it item that every kid has to have that Christmas. So prices skyrocket. Bob's Wholesale finds other buyers willing to pay $70 per unit. So Bob's decides to breach its contract with Ken's Toys and to sell the dolls at a higher price to other buyers. Ken's tries to cover by finding other suppliers for the dolls. However, the dolls are so scarce that every other supplier has them on back order, and there won't be enough made to meet the demand before Christmas. Since Ken's Toys can't cover by finding another supplier, it can ask the court to force Bob's Wholesale to replevy the dolls, forcing it to ship the goods that it promised. So here, it's not like we have something that's truly unique, and we have something that happens to be scarce at this point in time. So in this situation, it's really just impossible to cover, and so we can force the seller to send these dolls before Christmas, potentially. So another remedy that is possible under UCC Article 2 in specific special circumstances. We've mainly been looking at situations where the seller is in breach, but also we can have a situation where the buyer of goods is in breach of the contract. If a buyer breaches a contract, usually by not paying, then the seller hasn't delivered all of the goods yet. The UCC allows the seller to stop delivery of any goods that haven't been delivered yet. So that makes sense, because if the buyer is not paying, then we're not going to force the seller to keep shipping goods to them knowing you'll never get any money for them. So the UCC allows the seller to stop delivery if the buyer is in breach. If some of the goods are in transit, like on a truck on their way to the point of delivery, for instance, or at a warehouse somewhere between the buyer and the seller, then the seller can stop delivery of the goods. So he doesn't have to let them be on ship to this deadbeat buyer here. If the goods have already been delivered to the buyer, and then the buyer breaches the contract, the seller may be able to reclaim the goods, which means to get them back. The UCC says that the seller has to send a written notice to the buyer that it wants the goods back. But it's important to note, if the buyer doesn't send the goods back, then the seller cannot go and get them himself. So in other words, the seller, is mad at this deadbeat buyer. He cannot, get his commando team together and go raid the buyer's warehouse to reclaim these goods. Self-help is not an option here. He has to file suit and use the court system to get the goods back. And if he goes about this procedure, then he can do that. But again, self-help is not allowed under the law. You need to get the court system involved in that. If a buyer breaches a contract and then refuses to pay for goods that haven't been delivered yet, the seller has the power to dispose of the goods by selling them to somebody else. The buyer who is in breach then becomes liable for the damages to the seller from having to resell the goods. And so if if the buyer's in breach of the contract, the seller is sitting there with all these widgets that have been ordered by this buyer who's now in breach, well, he can resell those to somebody else. He doesn't have to just sit there, on these goods because the contract is out there. If the buyer's in breach, he can do something about that and try to cut his own losses on that. Here's an example. Let's say Sock Co. manufactures socks. It has a contract with Big Mart, which agrees to buy 1,000 cases of socks for $50,000. Sock Co. ships the socks, but while the socks are on a truck headed to Big Mart decides to breach the contract and tells Sock Co. it doesn't want the socks anymore. Sock Co. calls the shipping company and has the socks hauled back at a cost of $1,000. Meanwhile, Sock Co. finds another buyer for these socks, but this buyer will only pay $40,000, not our original price of $50,000. Sock Co. disposes of the socks by selling them to the new buyer. Sock Co. can sue Big Mart for breach of contract and recover the $10,000 difference in the sale price plus the $1,000 it cost to get the socks back from the shipper. So here we have the sock company disposing of the socks, but it doesn't mean throw them away. It means find another buyer. And so it's able to find another buyer, but again, they suffer damages because the new buyer can't pay as much as the original buyer, and they incur these incidental costs of getting the socks back. And so that's how disposing works under the UCC. Also, this example we just looked at is a great illustration for how damages are usually calculated in a contract for the sale of goods when it's the buyer who is in breach. Ordinarily, you take the contract price, here that's $50,000, then you subtract the market price at the time the goods were to be delivered, which was $40,000. And then that, of course, gives us $10,000 in damages to the seller, but then we add in the incidental damages, which here is $1,000 in extra shipping costs. So in this case, the seller suffered total damages of $11,000. And so that's just kind of a good illustration of how normally we would calculate money damages in a case like this, where the buyer is the one who's in breach. Sometimes we might have an unusual situation where the seller can sue the buyer and force the buyer to pay the full purchase price for the goods even though the buyer has breached the contract. This looks a lot like the remedy of specific performance. Well, when might this happen? Well, let's say that the goods are destroyed at the point in time after the title has passed to the buyer. Let's say, for instance, we have a contract which calls for the buyer to pick up the goods at the seller's place of business. So in that case, as soon as the goods are identified, then title passes to the buyer. Well, if the buyer then breaches the contract, fails to pay, and then the warehouse later burns down with the goods inside, the buyer is still going to have to pay for the goods. So we can't cover in that situation, can we? Because the goods are gone. Let's say that it's socks again. They're a heap of ashes now. We can't resell them to somebody else. And so in a situation like that, we can get a remedy very much like specific performance and force the buyer to actually pay the amount that they agreed to pay in the first place, because there's no way to cover, there's no way to dispose of these goods in an economically productive way. And so then we could get this special kind of remedy. And this kind of remedy might also be available if the goods can't be disposed of by selling to another buyer, if there's something about them that doesn't make that possible. Let's look at an example here. Jessica places an order for t-shirts with Print Co. And the shirts all have Jessica's picture on them and say, "Jessica is awesome." Well, after the shirts are printed, Jessica breaches the contract, refuses to accept delivery, so she's not going to pay for them. Well, no one but Jessica was ever going to want these shirts, and probably no one else would ever buy them, so they cannot be disposed of by selling to a third party. And they're just, they're not able to resell these to any other buyer. So Print Co. can sue Jessica for the full purchase price of the shirts in that situation, because it's just impossible to dispose of the goods in any kind of economically productive way. Well, what we've been looking at here are the default rules for damages for breach under Article 2. It's important to realize, though, the parties are free to establish in the contract itself what's going to happen in the event of a breach and to limit the remedies that are available. They can even change the remedies entirely, such as providing for liquidated damages instead of actual damages. And so there is a lot of freedom for the parties to deal with this in the contract. I think I mentioned this before. It's kind of like a prenuptial agreement. It's kind of unromantic to be planning for your marriage to fail before you get married, but here we kind of do that with contracts too. We can plan for what happens if there is a breach and what damages are available and that kind of thing. And parties might want to do that because, breaches of contract do happen sometimes. And so it might be better to plan ahead. If you don't like the default rule, Article 2 does give you the chance to change it. We're going to shift gears now, pretty dramatically, I guess, but we're going to talk about sales and lease warranties. And we're just going to kind of take this chance to breeze through this a little bit. It seemed like a good time to do it now while we're already talking about breach and remedies, because it's kind of the same sorts of concepts a little bit. A warranty, we use that in common everyday language all the time. It's just a legal guarantee that a good which is sold meets certain standards. So if you buy a toaster and it doesn't work, you look to see if there's a warranty where you can take it back to the manufacturer and get a new toaster or make them fix it or something. That's just what a warranty is. There's two types, though. The first is an express warranty, and this is made when a seller makes a specific guarantee that a good being sold meets a certain standard. And so if you buy your toaster and you look in the owner's manual and there's this fancy little certificate looking thing that says, you have a year to return the toaster if it blows up, they'll give you a new toaster. Well, that's an express warranty. They actually made some kind of overt promise in words here saying that this toaster isn't going to be defective. And an express warranty can cover several different things, and the most obvious one is that the good is free from defects. Could be, for instance, that the product will work for at least 90 days. Of course, usually it will die on day 91, is usually how it works for me, but they could have some kind of guarantee this is going to work as it was designed for a particular period of time. Really, the possibilities are endless. And again, I already mentioned this, if you buy your toaster, there's a little piece of paper in there. If you read it, it'll say, within the first 90 days, you can take it back to the store. And after that, you can call 1-800-TOASTERS or something and gripe about it not working. And they might send you a new toaster or tell you where to ship it back or something like that. So that's an express warranty. No one is going to force a seller to make an express warranty. They just do that on their own in order to convince the buyer to buy the goods. If the seller later fails to honor the warranty, that's what we call a breach of warranty, and the buyer can sue for damages. But anyway, the seller, does make this voluntarily, and no one has a gun to their head making them make this warranty. But they will do that in order to make their goods more marketable. You will buy your toaster, with more confidence if you think that you can do something about it if it dies on you. So it's just a marketing tool, basically. So if they don't keep up their end of the promise there, then they're committed a breach of warranty, and they can be liable for that. When you have an express warranty, that has to be a statement of fact, not just an opinion. If you have a statement, this is the best toaster on the market, well, that's just an opinion. You can't prove, well, what's best mean? It might mean one thing to one person, one thing to another person. So that's not something you can, prove in a scientific laboratory that this is the best toaster ever. And it's just a matter of opinion. And you can't have a warranty based on something like that. But if you have a statement like this toaster will not break down within the first year of normal operation, well, that's the statement of fact. We can measure that. And so if the toaster does break and the seller refuses to fix or replace it or give you a refund, then we have a breach of an express warranty. And so that's how warranties work. But they're not just based upon what we call puffery. This is the best thing ever, but actually some kind of statement of fact that we can verify and measure. It's going to work for a certain amount of time. It's not going to have this kind of defect or whatever the case may be. When we look at damages for breach of warranty, that can range from the cost of just replacing or fixing the goods to a whole lot more, depending on the circumstances. If a seller gives a warranty that a toaster is going to work properly for a year and the toaster breaks, the seller may have to provide a new toaster or refund the sale price. So there we're not talking about damages that are too great. If it's a $30 toaster, we're talking about $30 of liability plus shipping for the new toaster, maybe something like that. But we might have a situation where if the toaster breaks and starts a fire and burns down your house, maybe even killing someone who was inside the house, Well, then the seller may be subject to a whole range of damages. And they can try to limit those damages somewhat in the language of the warranty, but they might be on the hook for a whole lot more than the value of a toaster. So it can vary a lot depending on the circumstances. And again, the person making the warranty can attempt to limit their liability in the language of the warranty itself. They might be liable for other reasons other than breach of warranty if this happens, but all kinds of products liability theories we could throw at them, like negligence and strict liability and stuff like that. So they'll still be on the hook, but they could try to get off the hook for breach of warranty if they artfully draft their express warranty document. Those are express warranties, but we also have situations sometimes where the law will create a warranty. Even if the seller didn't expressly make one, we'll still assume that it's there because the law made it, and that's what we call an implied warranty. The UCC sticks merchants with what is called the implied warranty of merchantability. If you are a toaster merchant, then every toaster you sell will come with the implied warranty of merchantability. The UCC says that parties can agree by contract to waive this implied warranty, but unless the contract says otherwise, every toaster will come with a warranty that it is, quote, fit for the ordinary purpose for which it is sold. And that is the implied warranty of merchantability, and that something is fit for the ordinary purpose for which you would buy it. So in the case of a toaster, that's going to mean that the toaster that's sold is warranted to be able to do what toasters would ordinarily do, which is toast bread. And so there's an implied warranty that this toaster is going to be able to toast something and to operate like a toaster normally would. That's why you buy a toaster. And so as long as you're buying it from a toaster merchant, we would assume that it's going to be able to do that. There's an implied warranty there. And again, this only applies to merchants who deal in that type of good. So if you sell your old toaster at a garage sale and you are not a toaster merchant, then you will not be giving an implied warranty when you sell your toaster. So you can sleep better at night knowing that. But this only applies to merchants. And again, that merchant designation is pretty important in the UCC. But if you are a merchant in a good and you sell that good, you are giving an implied warranty because the law says so, whether you want to or not. If you don't do anything to get rid of it, it's going to be there. Food products that are sold by food merchants have an implied warranty of fitness for human consumption. So if you go buy food from a store or at a restaurant, it's not supposed to make you sick. It's not supposed to have strange foreign objects in it, or whatever. It's supposed to be fit to eat. So that is another example of an implied warranty. Also, the UCC creates an implied warranty of fitness for a particular purpose, and that happens in situations where the seller knows the buyer intends to use the goods for a specific purpose, and the seller then says that the goods will work for that purpose. Well, let's look at an example to kind of make that a little more clear. In our example, Missouri Eastern State University contracts to buy computers from Tangerine Computers, Inc. Mesu tells Tangerine that it wants to buy computers that are fast enough to make calculations that solve problems in particle physics. Tangerine salesman assures Mesu that the computers will be able to do exactly that. So Mesu buys the computers. The computers work just fine exactly as they were designed. However, they are not actually fast enough to perform the calculations that Mesu bought them to perform. So these computers, they work exactly like they were supposed to when they left the line in the factory. But the salesman didn't know what he was talking about because the buyer here wanted to use them for a specific purpose, and the salesman told him, oh yeah, that'll work. But in fact, they would not work for that purpose. So Tangerine Computers has breached the implied warranty of fitness for a particular purpose. And so when the salesman made that promise that, yeah, that'll work for the problem you want to solve, there suddenly we have this implied warranty coming into play, which ended up being breached. Warranties can be disclaimed by language in the contract, and if you have a disclaimer, that will waive the warranty. So again, the UCC gives a lot of freedom to parties to kind of make their own rules as they go, as long as they're all in agreement, and these implied warranties even can be disclaimed. But the UCC requires that a disclaimer must be conspicuous in order to be effective. That is, you can't bury it in little bitty fine print where no one is ever going to see it. And you will see once in a while some contracts will contain language that is in large, bold, underlined, everything they can do to make it really stand out that says no warranties are being made, express, or implied. And language like that can cancel out even the implied warranty. So again, you're buying that at your own risk. And really, that ought to give a buyer pause, like, why did they put that in there? Or they think the toaster is going to burn my house down. So that might make you stop and scratch your head a little bit before you buy from that person. But anyway, if the parties want to do away with the warranties, they can. There are other implied warranties as well under the UCC, and basically the UCC implies warranties that the seller actually owns the goods that he's selling, that they're not stolen, that the goods are not encumbered by any security interests, so they're not, no one's going to come repossess it after you buy it, that the goods don't contain any patent or trademark infringements. And so basically you're not buying a lawsuit, basically, is what these other implied warranties are designed to do. So they're basically there to ensure that the seller has a legal right to sell the goods to the buyer. And again, we're not going to get too far down in the weeds looking at all these implied warranties. But do know that it's a little bit different under the UCC. We do have some additional protections for buyers and sellers, and some things that are a little bit different. But again, the basic theory of breach and remedies still applies. They've just modified it a little bit for sales of goods. So with that said, that brings us to the end of the notes for this week. Hope you're still with me and still enjoying contracts as much as you were the first day that we started studying them. So with that, hope you have a great week, and I will talk to you next time.